tempting to treat emperorship as a fixed, top of the pyramid. But the Roman world did not stand still. Between AD 193 and 284, the empire went through shocks that changed how authority was claimed, displayed, and defended. Individual rulers in the 3rd century were challenged constantly, especially after the mid-200s and 30s. Yet the imperial office remained the main point around which politics, loyalty, and legitimacy still revolved. When Diocletian later introduced a system in which more than one emperor ruled at the same time, and when rulers began to present themselves in a more openly commanding, lordly style rather than the older language of first citizen, it looked like a sharp break with the earlier centuries. But that break did not appear out of nowhere. It was the visible crest of a long, uneven transition that had been building for decades. As the background of emperors changed, the military became more decisive, and the empire's crises made old expectations harder to sustain. In the 1st and 2nd centuries, the typical emperor came from the senatorial world. The early imperial system grew out of a republic, where the Senate and its leading families had long dominated public office, and the first emperors were expected to fit into that elite universe. Even when emperors were outsiders in personality or style, they were still usually insiders by status. Senators, with the education, social networks, and public image that matched Rome's ruling class. By the end of the 2nd century, though, the political landscape was shifting. Men with equestrian beginnings, people who had started on a lower rung of the elite ladder, could rise into the Senate, and some began to look like realistic candidates for the throne. A number of late 2nd century claimants illustrate this change. Figures who did not begin as ancient aristocrats, but climbed through service and promotion. That did not yet destroy the ideal of a senatorial emperor, but it loosened it. The year 193 exposed how fragile the system could become when force, not consensus, decided succession. In the chaos after the death of an emperor, multiple claimants were proclaimed by different power bases, armies in the provinces, guards in the capital, and regional commanders who could turn their troops into a political weapon overnight. The lesson was clear. Whoever could command soldiers and win recognition could try to become emperor, even if the traditional script said otherwise. A major step came in the early 3rd century when an emperor was raised who was not a senator at the moment of his proclamation. He was an equestrian at the very top of that order, serving as head of the imperial guard. His rise showed that the throne could be seized through the highest military administrative office without the old senatorial pathway. Yet this was still a transitional moment rather than a complete revolution. Powerful dynastic networks could still pull the system back toward familiar patterns, and family legitimacy remained a potent language. Imperial relatives, court alliances, and carefully crafted claims about bloodlines could still decide who survived and who fell. The Severan house, with its connections and its ability to shape public perception, demonstrated that even when the throne was shaken, a dynasty could still try to control the story. Then the crisis deepened. The accession of a career soldier in 235 made it unmistakable that the earlier rulebook was no longer reliable. This ruler did not arrive from the polished world of senatorial prestige. He rose from the army, advanced through professional command, and was lifted by troops who valued battlefield authority above noble pedigree. His origins also signalled another turning point. The centre of gravity began shifting away from Italy and the old Mediterranean heartlands toward frontier regions where armies were concentrated and threats were constant. As the century progressed, emperors increasingly came from places tied to the Danube and Balkan military zones, regions that produced hardened commanders and offered ambitious soldiers a path upward. Over time, the empire started to look less like a state led by the old Roman aristocracy, and more like a machine that promoted men who could stabilize a front, control troops, and survive in a violent political climate. The year 238 underlined how many competing forces could claim the right to choose an emperor. Senators tried to reassert themselves, presenting rulers who could be framed as restorers of traditional governance. The very idea of joint rule could be presented as a return to older Roman habits of sharing power, yet the reality was harsher. Factions within the elite wanted their own champions, and the guards in Rome had their own expectations. In practice, the palace troops and the urban population could push the Senate into decisions it did not fully control. A young emperor emerged as a compromise figure, but real power soon flowed through the senior military administrator closest to him. That pattern, an emperor as the symbol and a powerful commander or prefect as the operator, created new opportunities for equestrian strongmen. It also reminded everyone that the throne could be dominated by those who controlled access, security, and the machinery of command, even when the emperor wore the crown. When that young ruler died, another leading officer from the guard rose to the purple, coming from provincial society far from Rome's ancient noble families. This was not just a personal story, it reflected a broader drift in the empire's hierarchy. Co-rulership and regional delegation became more common, but not always in official, neatly defined forms. Sometimes, brothers or close associates governed large areas in practice without receiving the full, formal titles that earlier emperors would have used to mark an heir. That kind of arrangement mattered because it hinted at a changing relationship between office, rank, and real authority. Senators still existed, still mattered in many settings, and still carried prestige, but the levers of decision were more and more often held by men whose power came from command roles and military trust rather than senatorial tradition. For a time, senatorial commanders continued to appear as emperors, especially when rulers needed experienced governors to calm dangerous frontiers. Ironically, sending a capable senator to restore order could backfire. The troops he was sent to control might proclaim him emperor instead. Several mid-century emperors fit this pattern. Men with high rank and conventional careers who were pulled into the storm because the border armies were the most decisive political audience in the empire. Yet even as senators returned to the throne in these episodes, the larger direction of travel continued. The last emperors who clearly belonged to the old, established senatorial aristocracy marked an endpoint. After their era, the dominant imperial profile increasingly became the frontier commander. A professional soldier, often from the Danube world, promoted by armies that were fighting constant wars and had little patience for distant ceremonial authority. By the late 260s and 270s, the imperial centre was repeatedly reshaped by generals from the Balkan and Danube regions. Coups were organised within the high command, and emperors could be removed by the very officers who had once served them. New rulers rose who likely owed their status to the broad expansion of Roman citizenship earlier in the century, men whose families had not long been part of the older Roman political class. Their careers point to a society where the army was one of the fastest routes to power and social elevation. Some later rulers tried to present themselves as more respectful of the Senate, and later writers sometimes painted these moments as a return to senatorial influence. But the deeper trend remained. The empire was being led by soldiers, and the throne increasingly belonged to whoever could command loyalty in the field and maintain control through force and rapid decision-making. This changing background of emperors was not happening in a vacuum. The strategic environment was deteriorating. The Roman Empire had reached its greatest territorial reach earlier, and after that its rulers focused more on holding ground than taking new land. That defensive posture could work when borders were stable, but the 3rd century brought repeated shocks. Across the Rhine and Danube, pressure increased as groups sought land, food, and security, and raids became more frequent and more dangerous. In the northeast and Balkans, repeated attacks created emergencies that demanded emperors be present, yet presence in one zone meant absence in another. In the east, the old rival empire was replaced by a new Persian power that was more aggressive and ambitious. This new enemy fought hard for strategic cities and corridors, aiming to control fortified routes and key strongholds. Major wars erupted, and Rome suffered a catastrophe that became a symbol of humiliation and vulnerability. An emperor captured alive by the enemy. In a political culture built on victory, command, and the image of invincibility. That kind of event did not just wound pride, it shook the foundations of legitimacy. As external pressure grew, internal trust eroded. Soldiers in different regions began to proclaim their own emperors, turning frontier armies into election machines. The army had always been crucial to imperial power, but now it acted faster, more often, and with less restraint. The pattern seen in 193, multiple claimants raised by different armed constituencies, became a recurring rhythm, especially after 235. Emperors rose and fell in rapid succession. Some lasted months, some only weeks. The most turbulent zones were precisely those under the greatest external stress: the Rhine and Danube regions, the Balkans, and the eastern frontier. In these places, imperial authority could feel distant. When the emperor was absent, the idea of emperorship remained powerful, but the person of the emperor could seem replaceable. That created fertile ground for coups, because local commanders could present themselves as the solution to immediate danger, while the official emperor appeared far away and ineffective. The results could be contradictory for provincial life. Armies could stimulate trade and demand, yet rival forces could also devastate communities, disrupt normal administration, and turn regions into battlegrounds of Roman against Roman. At the worst point, the empire nearly fractured. In the west, a powerful commander on the Rhine built a separate regime after defeating invaders and gaining local acclaim as a savior. He created an autonomous imperial structure across several provinces and maintained it for years. In the east, a different kind of solution emerged. A leading figure from a wealthy caravan city organized defense against Persia and took effective control of the region. For a time, this eastern strongman could still present himself as loyal to the Roman emperor, acting as protector rather than rival. But after his death, power passed to his family, and the relationship with Rome grew more ambiguous as local authority expanded. Eventually, the central emperor marched east to restore direct control, and later moved west to eliminate the separatist regime there as well. What made these breakaway powers so dangerous was not simply their existence, but what they revealed. Local military superiority could substitute for imperial authority, and the centre might tolerate that substitution until it became too threatening. Even when the empire was reunified, the episode left a scar. It strengthened the sense that emperors at the centre could lose control, and it increased the political weight of the Danube-based forces and commanders, who remained the most reliable instrument of reunification and enforcement. Throughout all this instability, emperors did not stop speaking the language of dynasty. Again and again, rulers tried to elevate sons or close relatives, signalling continuity through titles, honours, and public symbolism. Sometimes these promotions were timed to coincide with victories, moments of restored order, or the defeat of a rival. The message was consistent. The emperor was not a temporary warlord, but the founder of a lasting line. Yet the century did not cooperate. Only one dynasty managed to endure with real stability, and after the death of the last ruler from that house, most attempts at dynastic continuity collapsed quickly. Youth, sudden deaths, military coups, humiliations in war, and the murder of heirs shattered these plans. Even when a dynasty held on for 2 generations, disasters could drain it of credibility. The loss of dynastic stability mattered because heredity was more than family pride. It was a tool of legitimacy, especially with the army. When soldiers could no longer believe that an emperor's house would last, loyalty became more transactional, more conditional, and easier to redirect to a new commander, promising safety and reward. The 3rd century didn't just change who became emperor, it also changed what being emperor actually demanded. As rulers came from different social worlds and power shifted rapidly from one military group to another, the job itself was reshaped. In earlier imperial centuries, an emperor could devote huge attention to law, diplomacy, civic administration, and the day-to-day management of public life. He stood at the top of the legal system and the government machine. People could carry appeals upward until they reached him, and once a decision came from the emperor personally, there was nowhere higher to go. In the early empire, that final authority came with another practical advantage: access. Especially in Rome and Italy, people could realistically hope to reach the emperor, present a request, and receive an answer. That is why the ability to speak clearly, persuade, and write effectively mattered so much. An emperor was expected to communicate constantly, addressing elites, issuing decisions, responding to disputes, sending instructions across provinces, and managing relationships with foreign rulers. Even with a large support staff, a ruler's reputation grew when he could speak and write convincingly, because government in that world still moved through words, messages, and public performance. Yet even at its height, imperial decision-making often worked in a reactive rhythm. Most of the time, the emperor responded to problems that others put in front of him, rather than personally hunting for information or initiating inquiries. That balance began to tilt as the century grew more dangerous. War and emergency pulled emperors away from the routines of courtroom hearings, ceremonial audiences, and steady administrative oversight. As frontier pressure intensified, the emperor's military role became far more time-consuming and far more central to survival. The throne increasingly belonged to men whose careers had been built in camps and on campaign routes, and that background naturally shaped their priorities. A ruler who had risen through military command tended to spend more time with generals, officers, and mobile detachments than with civilian administrators, or the traditional political class. This had a direct consequence for ordinary subjects, city councils, and provincial communities. The emperor did not stop being the symbolic centre of the empire, but he became harder to reach. For people outside the military world, the emperor was no longer the most practical point of reference, and in some areas it could even be unclear who the recognised emperor was at any given moment. Civil and legal responsibilities still existed, but it makes sense that from the mid-3rd century onward, especially once crises became constant, military demands swallowed the largest share of a ruler's attention. Petitions and requests likely did not disappear. If anything, insecurity and local disorder could have encouraged more communities to seek help from the top. But the key change was how much of that business the emperor personally handled. The imperial office did not have unlimited time, and the pressures of the century made hands-on involvement less realistic. Earlier emperors could still be imagined as accessible public judges. In calmer years, a ruler might keep a regular routine of hearing cases, meeting advisors, and giving people enough time to present arguments. That image belongs to a world where peace existed often enough to create predictable schedules. But even before the crisis reached its worst, evidence shows the emperor sometimes refusing to become directly involved, even when people appealed to him for protection. Communities complained about abuses by soldiers and officials, confiscations, forced lodging, bullying, and exploitation. And they tried to bring such problems to the emperor's attention. In at least some cases, the emperor's response was essentially to push the matter back down the chain, instructing petitioners to return to their provincial governor and resolve it locally. That was not necessarily indifference. It reflects the practical reality that an emperor at the centre could not personally police every abuse across a vast empire, especially when he was fighting wars and trying to keep the throne from collapsing. Another revealing shift appears in the messengers themselves. In earlier centuries, civic representatives and skilled speakers often carried a city's requests. In the 3rd century, soldiers sometimes acted as the delivery system. A petition carried by a soldier could move faster and reach a ruler more directly because it could travel through military spaces, camps, headquarters, and marching columns, where a civilian delegation might not easily gain entry. A campaigning emperor, surrounded by troops, was simply more reachable through military channels than through formal civic ceremony. And when time was short, the old style of polished public persuasion mattered less than speed, access, and the ability to navigate a camp. Physical distance made this even more pronounced. As emperors spent less time in Rome, communication from the traditional heartlands became harder. Rome still mattered symbolically, and 3rd century rulers did not abandon it entirely. Many still appeared there at key moments soon after gaining power, for major celebrations, for public festivals, or to mark military success. Even later in the century, several emperors returned periodically, often in winter, between campaigns. They might also appear for formal occasions connected to the political calendar. But long, stable residence in the capital was no longer practical for most rulers after the middle of the century. The decisive action was usually on the frontiers or along the main roads that linked Western and Eastern theatres of war. The imperial court, in practice, became mobile. That mobility left footprints across the map. Certain cities repeatedly hosted emperors not because they replaced Rome in prestige, but because they sat on strategic routes. Northern Italy became a key hinge zone, where armies could pivot toward the Danube world or return toward the western provinces. Some cities functioned as gateways, places where emperors gathered troops, faced resistance, settled crises, or simply passed through on the way to a new emergency. Over time, these corridors of movement gained lasting importance. In later centuries, some of the same places would develop permanent palaces, administrative facilities, and the infrastructure expected of an imperial residence, because the logic that drew emperors there in the 3rd century did not vanish. The same pattern shaped the Balkans and the routes into Asia. Certain points on the European side of the Straits became frequent stopovers for emperors heading east or returning west. Major cities there could become arenas of civil war, sites of siege, or places rebuilt after devastation, only to rebound quickly because their location made them indispensable. The Eastern Mediterranean had its own magnets. Big urban centres like Antioch and Alexandria drew emperors for different reasons. One, often as an operational base in wars against Eastern enemies. The other, sometimes as a famous and wealthy city that attracted imperial attention. Further inland, cities in Anatolia appeared again and again because they lay on the paths armies marched and supply lines followed. In the far west and north, frontier capitals gained significance but also became vulnerable, exposed to raids, internal coups, and the instability of commanders who could turn an army into a political tool. Meanwhile, important military hubs along the Danube frontier served as winter headquarters, recruiting centres, proclamation sites, and, crucially, birthplaces of new emperors. When a city repeatedly becomes the place where soldiers proclaim rulers, it stops being just a provincial centre. It becomes part of the imperial engine. All of this points to a broader transformation. The centre of power drifted away from a single capital toward a network of strategic residences, marching routes, and frontier command posts. Rome remained loaded with tradition and symbolism, but decisions were increasingly shaped elsewhere, closer to the armies that could make or unmake emperors. This shift also changed how the emperor managed the workload of ruling. Delegation had always existed in the Roman system. Governors, commanders, financial officers, and legal officials handled vast responsibilities in different regions. The empire did not run on a single rigid constitution with a fixed job description for the emperor. Administration could be adapted to fit the needs of a particular reign. What became more visible across the 3rd century, however, was an intensifying tendency to push specific imperial functions into the hands of deputies. The reason is straightforward. As emperors spent more time campaigning and responding to emergencies, other people had to keep the machinery running. Legal business is a clear example. By the late 2nd century, the emperor's role as the highest judge could become overwhelming. Appeals multiplied when local decisions seemed unfair or incompetent, and litigants looked for a ruling that could not be challenged. In response, the government increasingly relied on substitute judges, high-status deputies empowered to hear cases in the emperor's place. At first, these deputies appear mainly in Rome, where legal traffic was heavy and where the emperor's presence created an obvious bottleneck. Later, the practice spread outward, with judges assigned to provincial contexts as well. In the provinces, their work could blur beyond narrow courtroom judgments and overlap with broader administrative or financial responsibilities. Even where the details are difficult to reconstruct, the direction is clear. The imperial centre was finding ways to resolve disputes and maintain authority without requiring the emperor to personally sit in judgment for every major issue. The same logic applied to other offices. If deputies could act on behalf of the emperor in legal matters, then the highest officials in Rome and beyond could also require substitutes when demands increased. Over time, the authority of major imperial officers expanded, and some began to function as the emperor's hands in both military and civilian domains. That trend fits a century in which the emperor could not be everywhere and could not do everything personally. At the broadest scale, the 3rd century even produced improvised forms of sharing imperial burdens through regional autonomy, though not by official design. When parts of the empire slipped into separatist regimes or semi-independent rule, it was not a voluntary administrative reform. It was a crisis. Yet the effect was still that other power centres took on responsibilities of defence and governance in certain areas, allowing the central emperor to concentrate on nearer threats. These breakaway structures also revealed a hard truth. The empire had grown so vast and so pressured that one man could struggle to control it directly, especially when major fronts erupted simultaneously. Even before formal reforms, rulers experimented with dividing responsibilities between East and West. Co-rule could place one emperor in one zone and another in a different theatre, reducing the danger of leaving a region without an imperial presence. Sometimes the division was official, with a recognised partner sharing the title. Sometimes it was more informal, with a trusted relative or commander given sweeping authority in a region without receiving full imperial status. Near the end of the century, emperors again used the same strategy. One son remained in the west, while another accompanied the senior ruler on an eastern campaign. So when a more structured division of imperial rule appears under Diocletian, it does not arrive like a bolt from the blue. It formalizes solutions that earlier rulers had tested under pressure, even if those earlier versions were unstable. These administrative and geographic shifts also reshaped the emperor's relationships with the key institutions around him, especially the military and the Senate. The military came first because the 3rd century made the emperor more dependent on soldiers than ever before. In times when emperors stayed in Rome regularly, the troops stationed in and around the capital had unusual leverage. They were close to the imperial household, they could influence access, and they could intervene in succession. But as emperors spent less time in Rome and more time on campaign, the emperor's immediate environment changed. Instead of being surrounded mainly by the capital's forces, he was increasingly accompanied by units that travelled with him and by the frontier troops and mobile detachments that dominated the crisis zones. That meant the most influential officers were no longer necessarily the ones tied to Rome. They were the commanders operating on the periphery. A gradual shift occurred. The political weight of the capital's guard diminished, while the influence of border armies and their leaders increased. At the same time, the leadership class within the army changed. Senators were less prominent as commanders, and professional soldiers who had climbed into equestrian officer ranks became more important. As these men repeatedly rose to the throne from the 260s onward, the line between the emperor and the emperor's generals became thinner. When emperors are selected from the same pool as the top commanders, relationships inside the high command become more tense and more competitive, because today's subordinate can imagine himself as tomorrow's ruler. Relations with the Senate shifted in parallel. The rise of a frontier-based military elite, dominated increasingly by equestrians and career officers, reduced the Senate's role as the natural source of emperors. That change produced resistance when the Senate tried to assert itself, but the long-term tide ran against it. By the later 3rd century, many emperors did not come from senatorial status at all, and even when they needed administrative cooperation, their survival depended more on army loyalty than on senatorial approval. These rulers had reached power through troops, held power through troops, and knew exactly how quickly that support could be withdrawn. The practical consequence was simple. Securing the frontier armies mattered more than cultivating the Senate in Rome. As emperors spent more time away from Rome, communication with the Senate became increasingly strained. Distance alone created obstacles, but another barrier was just as important. The emperors of the later 3rd century no longer resembled the educated aristocrats who had traditionally ruled the empire. Earlier, rulers had usually been senators trained in rhetoric and public life, men comfortable with the language and customs of Rome's political elite. By contrast, many later emperors were hardened military professionals who had risen through the ranks. They understood the world of the army far better than the traditions of senatorial politics. For members of the old aristocracy, especially those who valued classical education and refined manners, these new rulers could appear crude or unsophisticated. Some senators likely regarded them with quiet contempt, believing that these soldier emperors lacked the cultural background expected of Rome's highest authority. At the same time, the Senate itself became less important to the stability of imperial rule. Emperors increasingly held power without needing formal recognition from the Senate. By the later 3rd century, a ruler could act as emperor without waiting for senatorial approval. Military support mattered far more than political ceremony in Rome. Regional strongmen also contributed to this change. Some rebel leaders aimed only to control a single region rather than the entire empire. These men did not seek universal recognition or legitimacy from Rome. Their authority rested on local armies and provincial resources, not on acceptance by the Senate. This new political reality weakened the Senate's position even further. The place of senators within imperial administration also evolved. From the time of Septimius Severus onward, emperors increasingly appointed equestrian officials instead of senators to important posts, especially in provinces where military command was essential. Over time, professional officers replaced senators in several key positions. This shift has often been described as a decline in senatorial influence. Yet the picture was more complex. In regions that avoided long-lasting crises, especially Italy, Africa, and parts of Asia Minor, many aristocratic families continued to enjoy prestige and authority. Their importance did not disappear. In some areas, it may even have grown stronger as instability elsewhere disrupted older patterns of power. The transformation of emperorship during the 3rd century was not the result of a single cause, but of many overlapping developments. Civil wars, invasions, rebellions, famine, and disease had always been part of Roman history, but in this century they appeared simultaneously and on a scale that earlier generations had rarely faced. Multiple emergencies demanded attention at the same time, and the traditional system struggled to respond effectively. The emperor's authority remained immense in theory, yet in practice the reach of imperial power narrowed. More decisions were handled locally, and more responsibilities passed into the hands of deputies and regional officials. When people appealed to the emperor and were directed back to provincial authorities, it showed how much the structure of power had changed. Even when these arrangements were intended to improve efficiency, the effect was to reduce the emperor's central role in everyday life. The weakening of imperial control became most visible when entire regions slipped out of direct rule. The breakaway regimes in Gaul and the eastern provinces showed how far imperial authority could shrink in times of crisis. For a period, emperors could no longer command the full extent of the Roman world. At the same time, the visibility of imperial authority declined. Constant campaigning and travel made emperors less accessible, and the benefits of imperial government were less clearly felt in distant communities. The strongest foundation of imperial power remained the army. Control of major forces and success in war continued to determine whether a ruler survived. Earlier emperors had relied not only on military strength, but also on stable dynasties to legitimize their rule. After the death of Severus Alexander, that dynastic foundation largely disappeared, leaving soldiers as the primary source of authority. The social character of emperors changed along with the structure of power. During the first 2 centuries of the empire, emperors were normally drawn from the senatorial order. They were expected to possess education, political experience, and strong connections among Rome's elite families. Military ability was valuable, but it was only one part of a broader set of expectations. By the end of the 3rd century, the typical emperor had a very different background. Many were born in frontier regions and had risen through military service rather than aristocratic privilege. Their authority rested on achievement rather than ancestry. Birth, education, and social refinement mattered less than proven ability in command. These changes made communication with the Senate more difficult and deepened tensions between traditional elites and new rulers. Conflicts between emperors and senators reflected this growing divide. As emperors relied more heavily on armies stationed far from Rome, their surroundings changed as well. Increasingly, they were accompanied by frontier troops and mobile field forces. From the middle of the century onward, senior officers were repeatedly proclaimed emperor by their own soldiers. The distinction between emperor and general became less clear, since both came from the same professional environment. This blurred boundary made legitimacy harder to establish, especially in the eyes of the Senate. Senators found it difficult not only to influence emperors, but even to locate them, since rulers spent much of their time moving between war zones. Urgent problems often demanded immediate action, and people seeking help frequently turned to local power holders, instead of appealing to the emperor. In a century dominated by warfare, those local authorities were often military commanders. As these men gained influence, they also became dangerous rivals for imperial power. Across the empire, the balance of authority shifted steadily away from the traditional centre and toward the frontier regions. Political influence followed armies and strategic routes rather than ancient institutions. The rising number of challengers and breakaway regimes showed how often imperial authority was contested. Access to the emperor declined sharply, especially after the middle of the century, and the distance between ruler and subjects widened. In this environment, the reforms introduced at the end of the century appear less like sudden innovations and more like practical responses to long-term developments. The changes that followed were shaped by pressures that had been building for decades. The crises of the 3rd century also reshaped the senatorial order itself. Some historians once believed that senators lost their position as the leading elite and were replaced entirely by the equestrian order. More recent research suggests a more balanced picture. While senators did lose certain kinds of influence, especially in military command, they did not disappear from positions of importance. Several high offices remained in senatorial hands, even after later reforms reorganized the empire. Over time, the equestrian order gained authority at the expense of senators. Yet, in the long run, the equestrian order itself faded as its leading members were absorbed into the senatorial class. This continuity suggests that at least part of the senatorial elite managed to preserve its position despite the upheavals of the century. The senatorial order itself contained many layers. Not every senator belonged to the ruling elite. Only a small number advanced through the highest offices and reached the rank of consul. These men formed a narrow circle at the top of the senatorial hierarchy. Their careers were usually better documented than those of lesser senators, allowing a clearer view of how elite families maintained influence over time. Certain high offices remained particularly important markers of status and authority. The ordinary consulship, the prefecture of Rome, and the governorships of the wealthy provinces of Africa and Asia continued to be associated with the highest levels of prestige. Senators who held these positions stood at the centre of aristocratic power. Several prominent families repeatedly appear among the holders of these offices throughout the 3rd century. Even when political conditions were unstable, members of these families continued to reach the highest ranks. This pattern suggests the existence of a stable core within the senatorial elite. Whether or not these families were actually related by blood, belonging to a recognized aristocratic lineage, carried great weight. Claims of descent from distinguished ancestors could strengthen a senator's reputation and improve his chances of advancement. Even invented genealogies reveal how important family prestige remained in Roman society. Some aristocrats traced their ancestry back through generations of office holders, while others emphasized connections to famous names in order to enhance their standing. Evidence for family relationships is often incomplete, and many connections can only be guessed from similarities in names or from inscriptions found in the same regions. Yet even uncertain relationships demonstrate the importance Romans placed on belonging to a distinguished lineage. A recognized family name could open doors to the highest offices and reinforce a senator's authority. Among the families that remained influential for decades, a number can be identified as forming the backbone of the senatorial elite. Members of these lineages held major offices repeatedly over long periods of time. Their careers extended across several generations, demonstrating an ability to adapt to changing political conditions. Although other families certainly existed, this group provides the clearest example of continuity within the senatorial aristocracy during the 3rd century. One of the best documented examples is the Caesonian family, whose members rose steadily through the ranks over several generations. The earliest prominent member known from this period appears to have come from Italy and may not have belonged to an ancient aristocratic lineage. His career followed the normal path of senatorial advancement, beginning with minor administrative duties and progressing through military and provincial assignments. Early service included work in Rome's police administration and a military posting with a legion stationed along the Danube frontier. These experiences combined civil and military training, preparing him for higher responsibilities. After completing the early stages of his career, he served in provincial administration and eventually reached the rank of praetor. His advancement continued through a series of financial and administrative appointments in Italian towns and provinces. He also held a legionary command and governed a minor province before reaching the consulship. Support for the ruling emperor during a civil conflict likely helped secure this promotion. From that point forward, his career brought increasing prestige. He oversaw major public works in Rome and governed important frontier provinces. Eventually, he reached one of the highest posts available to a senator, the governorship of Africa. Late in life, he remained close to the imperial court, receiving honours that reflected his long service. His son followed a similar path but rose even higher. After beginning with judicial duties in Rome, he advanced rapidly through the ranks. The family had by then entered the patrician class, and this status allowed him to move more quickly towards senior offices. His career included administrative work in Italian cities and service in Africa before reaching the consulship. During a major political crisis, he was chosen as one of the senators entrusted with restoring stability, a sign of the confidence placed in him by his peers. He later governed Africa and held the prestigious office of prefect of Rome. His career ended with important judicial responsibilities, carried out on behalf of the emperor. The 3rd generation maintained the family's position. Born into an already distinguished household, he advanced through the early stages of office holding and reached the consulship during a turbulent period of imperial history. His responsibilities included administrative posts in Italy and several important assignments in Africa. Eventually, he governed the African provinces for an extended period and later carried out high judicial duties in both Rome and Africa. Honours continued to accumulate, including a second consulship and the prefecture of Rome. Religious offices added further prestige, linking the family to Rome's traditional institutions. Over the course of a century, this family rose from relative obscurity to the highest ranks of Roman society. Their success shows that the upheavals of the 3rd century did not destroy the senatorial aristocracy. Instead, some families adapted successfully and even strengthened their position. Their careers reveal several consistent patterns. Service in Italy remained central, especially in administrative roles, connected with finance and public works. Africa also appeared repeatedly as a region of responsibility. Military commands played a smaller role over time, while administrative and judicial duties became more important. These families benefited from imperial trust and avoided involvement in rebellions or political intrigues. Their loyalty allowed them to survive frequent changes of regime. By forming marriage alliances with other prominent families, they strengthened their position even further. Through careful adaptation and steady service, they remained influential long after the crisis years had passed. Other aristocratic families show similar patterns. Many had strong ties to Italy, either through origin or long residence. Even families that originally came from the provinces often became deeply integrated into Roman society. Land ownership, public benefactions, and family connections bound them closely to Italy and to the capital. In most cases, their exact origins are difficult to determine, since senators often invested heavily in Italian estates regardless of where their ancestors had come from. Nevertheless, the evidence suggests that the leading senatorial families of the 3rd century were strongly connected to Italy, whether by birth or by long tradition. Another common feature was the attainment of patrician rank. Many elite families either possessed ancient patrician status or were admitted into the patriciate during the imperial period. This distinction still carried prestige, even if its practical importance gradually declined. By the 3rd century, belonging to the patriciate was less essential for holding high office than it had once been, but it remained a mark of aristocratic honour. Like the Cisoni, many of the leading senatorial families of the 3rd century continued to receive appointments in Rome and across Italy. They were also frequently entrusted with offices in long-established and relatively stable provinces, such as Africa, Asia, Spain, and Greece. These regions, unlike the troubled frontiers, escaped the worst destruction of the century's wars and invasions and preserved much of their earlier prosperity. In some cases, members of the same family appeared repeatedly in the same parts of the empire. Certain families were regularly associated with North Africa and Numidia, others with Spain, and still others with Syria. The surviving evidence is too fragmentary to prove that this repetition resulted from a deliberate policy. Yet, the pattern suggests a degree of administrative continuity. The persistence of senatorial authority in these regions corresponds with broader signs of stability, visible in archaeology and inscriptions, which show that economic life in many Western provinces continued without severe long-term decline. By contrast, senatorial appointments in frontier regions exposed to constant warfare became increasingly rare after the middle of the century. Provinces along the Danube and Rhine, as well as the eastern war zones, were largely entrusted to other kinds of officials. At the same time, the character of senatorial careers gradually changed. Members of these prominent families were increasingly selected for civil and administrative responsibilities, rather than for military commands. They appear more often as financial supervisors, legal authorities, or special commissioners responsible for investigating local conditions and settling disputes. Their education, wealth, and high social rank made them well suited to these tasks. Yet after the middle of the century, they almost disappear from governorships in provinces where legions were stationed. Such commands increasingly went to experienced military professionals, many of them from the equestrian order. Several family histories illustrate this development clearly. Earlier generations still governed heavily militarized provinces along major frontiers, but later generations were assigned only civil responsibilities in quieter regions. Even senators who had earlier commanded troops were rarely entrusted with comparable authority later in their careers. One apparent exception held office in eastern provinces during a time when effective military control lay in the hands of a powerful regional commander, suggesting that his authority was limited in practice. Overall, these elite families remained influential in prosperous and traditionally prestigious provinces, where warfare was less intense. Their appointments preserved honour and status, but avoided granting them extensive military power. The families that dominated the highest offices of the empire shared several important characteristics. Many belonged to the old patrician aristocracy, or eventually entered it. Most maintained strong ties to Italy and especially to Rome. During the decades when the empire faced its greatest difficulties, these families were most often employed in civilian administration and in stable regions rather than in active war zones. They regularly occupied the most prestigious posts open to senators, including the consulship, major provincial governorships in peaceful areas, and the prefecture of the city of Rome. Taken together, these families formed a recognizable inner circle within the senatorial elite. Over long stretches of time, they managed to preserve or even strengthen their position, creating a stable core that continued to dominate prestigious offices. Membership in this inner circle did not continue automatically, from one generation to the next. Families took deliberate steps to protect their position and ensure that their descendants remained part of the highest aristocracy. Marriage alliances linked leading houses together and strengthened their collective influence. Adoption provided another way to preserve continuity when families lacked male heirs. Through such arrangements, property, prestige, and political connections could pass smoothly from one generation to the next. These alliances also reinforced shared cultural standards, limiting the entry of newcomers who might not possess the education and refinement valued by the traditional elite. Many family connections can be traced through names that combine elements from different lineages, showing how aristocratic houses merged through marriage and inheritance. Some families joined together so closely that their identities gradually blended. These connections could extend across several generations and sometimes even link aristocratic families to the imperial household itself. Such alliances often strengthened a family's position, but they did not guarantee survival. Political reversals or violent changes of power could still bring an abrupt end to a distinguished lineage. Although social advancement became more common from the 2nd century onward, and new men continued to enter the Senate, access to the innermost circle remained limited. Elite families tended to marry within their own social level, and often within familiar regional networks. Wealth and influence passed from parents to children, reinforcing continuity across generations. In many respects, this small group resembled a closed community with limited space for outsiders. Yet complete stability was never guaranteed. Some families maintained prominence for generations, while others disappeared and were replaced by new arrivals. When established lineages failed to produce heirs or lost their position, ambitious families from slightly lower ranks stood ready to take their place. This process of gradual replacement ensured that the elite renewed itself without losing its overall character. Strategic alliances played a central role in this process. Adoption could create the appearance of continuity, even when a family line had actually ended. Through careful marriages and inheritance arrangements, aristocratic houses strengthened their ties to one another and preserved their collective status. Membership in this elite circle mattered more than strict descent from a particular ancestor. Marriages usually joined families of similar rank and often linked households with shared social traditions. These patterns helped preserve cohesion within the aristocracy and reinforced the boundaries that separated it from the wider senatorial order. Even with these precautions, some families eventually lost their place. When established lineages failed to maintain their position, opportunities opened for new entrants. A large proportion of the families that later dominated the senatorial elite first reached the consulship during the reigns of Marcus Aurelius and Septimius Severus. The crises of those reigns, wars, disease, and political purges, likely reduced the number of established aristocratic families and created space for newcomers. Some of these new consuls were successful military commanders, rewarded for loyalty in times of danger. Their rise shows that renewal often followed periods of heavy loss within the elite. The length of time a family remained within the highest ranks varied greatly. Some traced their ancestry back to the Republican period, while many others rose to prominence only in the 2nd century. By the middle of the 3rd century, nearly half of the leading families disappeared from the lists of ordinary consuls. This absence meant that their members no longer qualified for the highest offices. Some families lost influence when the ruling dynasty changed, but others declined even though their prominence had begun much earlier. Silence in the historical record does not always indicate decline, yet the complete disappearance of some lineages suggests that they withdrew from political life or failed to maintain their position. A family might remain senatorial in rank, without continuing to belong to the small circle that dominated imperial administration. This inner circle certainly included more families than can be identified with certainty. Surviving evidence highlights only a portion of the aristocracy. Even so, enough information remains to reveal significant continuity between status and power among the leading families. Their repeated appearance in the highest offices shows that influence remained concentrated in relatively few hands. Earlier studies of the Roman Senate used statistical methods to examine patterns of inheritance and promotion. Those studies showed that membership in the Senate itself was not strictly hereditary, and that holding the consulship did not automatically pass from father to son. Yet they also recognized that the highest-ranking senators formed a distinct group within the Senate. A closer examination of individual careers suggests an even more concentrated structure. Within the senatorial elite stood a smaller cluster of families who repeatedly occupied the most prestigious positions. Their influence extended across generations and gave them a leading role in imperial administration. Attempts to divide the senatorial elite into rigid categories of social prestige and political power do not fit the realities of the 3rd century very well. Earlier distinctions between highly prestigious families and politically active families gradually lost their meaning once senators ceased to command major armies. From the middle of the century onward, military authority passed increasingly into the hands of professional officers outside the senatorial order. Yet this did not mean that the aristocracy became powerless. In peaceful provinces and in Italy itself, senators exercised considerable influence. The absence of large military establishments in those regions allowed them to dominate local political life more completely. Their authority in civil administration, law, and finance often grew as their military role declined. Changes within the senatorial elite followed patterns shaped by crisis and recovery. Periods of war and epidemic increased mortality among aristocrats and opened opportunities for advancement. In calmer times, the elite became more stable again. High-ranking senators were more likely than others to pass their position to descendants, and continuity remained strongest at the very top of the hierarchy. Although provincial families entered the Senate in growing numbers, relatively few penetrated the inner circle. Those who did often developed strong ties to Italy and Rome, sometimes overshadowing their provincial origins. Some provincial senators may have preferred to return home after completing their official careers, where their status brought greater influence than it could in Rome. Whether this happened frequently is uncertain, but the limited presence of provincials in the inner circle suggests that the core aristocracy remained largely intact. The Senate of the 3rd century was not a hereditary body in a strict sense. Even so, membership in the highest aristocratic circle tended to pass from generation to generation. Families strengthened their chances of survival through alliances and careful planning, preserving their place within the elite. Their collective influence remained significant, particularly in certain regions and areas of administration. Despite the upheavals of the century, Roman society did not undergo a complete transformation. Prestigious offices remained largely in senatorial hands, and they were not permanently transferred to other groups. Access to the highest ranks remained restricted, even as opportunities for advancement increased elsewhere in society. Senators outside the inner circle may have suffered more severely from the disorders of the age, but the leading families preserved a notable degree of continuity. During the 2nd and 3rd centuries, a number of powerful senatorial families rose to prominence and maintained influence across several generations. Among them was a line later known as the Fulvii Ameliani. One of the earliest identifiable members was Aemilianus, a man who advanced through the traditional senatorial career during the reign of Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. He served as quaestor and later as praetor with imperial backing, which suggests that by this time his family already belonged to the highest aristocratic circles and likely held patrician rank. This early advancement laid the foundation for later generations who would secure some of the most prestigious positions in the Roman state. The first member of the family to reach the highest level of office in the turbulent years of the 3rd century was Fulvius Gavius Petronius Aemilianus, who held the ordinary consulship in the early years of the century. He was probably the son of the earlier praetor and became the father of 2 later consuls, who continued the family tradition. His political partnerships connected him with other prominent aristocratic houses, including the ancient Nummii and other respected senatorial lineages. These alliances were not accidental. Marriage ties and political cooperation helped preserve influence within the narrow circle of Rome's governing elite. Evidence suggests that the Fulvii Ameliani may also have been linked to other noble families that had held office for generations, strengthening their position within the aristocracy. Several members of this family appear in the consular lists during the early 3rd century, but after the middle of the century, their name disappears from the highest offices. A later consul named Aemilianus may have belonged to the same line, though the connection remains uncertain. Like many senatorial families, their prominence rose and declined within only a few generations. Another important aristocratic lineage was the Hedii Loliani, a family probably originating in northern Italy. They had already achieved consular rank during the 2nd century and remained influential into the early 3rd. The family traced its prestige back through several generations of consuls and provincial governors. One of the most prominent figures was Quintus Hedius Rufus Lollianus Gentianus, whose career combined military command, provincial administration, and close service to the emperor. He commanded a legion, governed important provinces, and eventually reached the highly prestigious position of proconsul of Asia. His presence in the emperor's entourage during major military campaigns shows that he belonged to the trusted inner circle of imperial advisors. Gentianus came from a distinguished background. His father and grandfather had both held consulships, and his brother also rose to similar rank. The family maintained its influence through the next generation. Gentianus had several children who entered the highest aristocratic ranks. 2 of his sons became ordinary consuls, while a daughter held the position of chief Vestal Virgin, one of the most respected religious roles in Roman society. These achievements show how aristocratic families could concentrate prestige in both political and religious offices at the same time. The Hedii Loliani also strengthened their position through marriage alliances. One daughter married into another influential senatorial family, and through this connection the family became related to the future emperor Valerian. Their descendants continued to hold high office for a time, but eventually the family name disappears from the lists of consuls. Like many noble houses, their influence proved strong, but not permanent. A very different example of social advancement is provided by the Marii. Unlike the older aristocratic families, the Marii rose from the equestrian order during the 2nd century. The father of the family's most famous members served as an imperial financial officer, and it was through imperial favour that his sons entered the Senate. The rise of the family accelerated during the civil wars that followed the death of Commodus. One of the brothers, Marius Maximus, distinguished himself as a military commander in the service of Septimius Severus. His loyalty and success brought rapid advancement and eventually the consulship. Marius Maximus built one of the most remarkable careers of his time. He governed several important provinces and commanded armies during major campaigns. Later, he held the rare distinction of governing both Africa and Asia, the two most prestigious provinces available to senators. Such appointments show the extraordinary confidence placed in him by the emperors he served. His career continued across several reigns, and he eventually became prefect of the city of Rome, one of the highest offices available to a senator. In addition to his political career, he wrote biographies of earlier emperors, demonstrating that members of the military aristocracy could also participate in literary culture. Other members of the Marii followed similar paths. His brother also achieved the consulship and governed frontier provinces where military experience was essential. The next generation maintained the family's position, with sons and nephews reaching the consulship in the decades that followed. Yet after the middle of the 3rd century, the family disappears from the highest offices. Their rapid rise and equally rapid decline illustrate how fragile aristocratic success could be in an age of political instability. The Nummii formed another influential senatorial house, whose origins lay in Italy. Their estates were located in northern and southern regions of the peninsula, and their ties to Italian cities remained strong throughout their history. The first member of the family to achieve the consulship during this period was Nummius Senecio Albinus, who rose to prominence in the early 3rd century. His career included judicial responsibilities carried out on behalf of the emperor as well as provincial governorships. Such appointments indicate that he enjoyed considerable trust at the highest levels of government. Senecio Albinus was followed by his son, who also became consul and continued the family's political tradition. Later generations remained active as well. One descendant served twice as prefect of Rome and later became consul again, while another reached the consulship during the troubled middle decades of the century. Despite the political upheavals of the time, the family survived and even extended its influence into later centuries, demonstrating a remarkable continuity that few other aristocratic houses could match. The Polliani provide another example of a senatorial family whose influence stretched across several generations. Probably of Italian origin, they first achieved prominence in the later 2nd century. The elder Pollianus Auspex held a consulship and governed important provinces, including Africa. His career also included service as a judicial deputy of the emperor, a position that required both legal knowledge and political reliability. His son followed a similar path and governed several frontier provinces where military forces were stationed. Members of the Pollianus family enjoyed close connections with the imperial court. One relative was saved from prosecution through the intervention of his powerful uncle, a sign of the influence the family possessed. Later generations continued to reach high office. A descendant held a consulship in the early 3rd century and governed North Africa, while another member adopted into the family eventually became consul as well. Despite this success, the family disappears from the highest offices after the middle of the century. The Pomponii formed another long-established senatorial lineage, with roots reaching back to earlier centuries. Several members of this family had already held consulships before the 3rd century began. During the early decades of the new century, one Pomponius Abassus reached the consulship and later governed an important frontier province. His career ended violently when he was executed during the reign of Elagabalus, after which the emperor married his widow. Such events demonstrate how political success could quickly turn into disaster in the unstable environment of the time. Later members of the family returned to prominence. A descendant reached the consulship again and later served as prefect of Rome. He eventually shared a consulship with the Emperor Aurelian and became one of the most respected senators of his generation. After his career, however, the family fades from the historical record. The Postumii appear to have descended from distinguished ancestors of the 2nd century and combined several influential lineages through marriage. By the middle of the 3rd century, they had again reached the highest ranks. One member commanded a legion in Britain before becoming consul and later prefect of Rome. His relatives also held important offices, including consulships and city prefectures, showing that the family maintained influence across several decades. Another member of the family became consul shortly after the fall of the Gallic Empire and served in administrative roles within Italy. Other relatives followed similar careers, and one descendant achieved even greater distinction in the early 4th century. Although the family remained important for some time, their prominence eventually declined after reaching its peak in the later 3rd century. The Valerii represented one of the most prestigious aristocratic houses of the period and claimed descent from one of the oldest noble families of the Roman Republic. Members of this lineage emphasized their ancient ancestry by adopting traditional family names associated with famous Republican statesmen. After a period of relative obscurity, the family reappeared among the leading senators at the end of the 2nd century. One of the earliest prominent members during this period became consul in the late 2nd century, but was later executed during the reign of Caracalla. Despite this setback, the family quickly recovered. His probable son reached the consulship in the following generation, and later governed one of the most prestigious provinces of the empire. Further descendants continued to achieve high office, including multiple consulships and important administrative positions in Rome itself. Over the course of the 3rd century, several members of the Valerii held ordinary consulships, demonstrating the family's enduring influence. Their careers included service as city prefects, supervisors of public works, and governors of wealthy provinces. One later descendant became consul toward the end of the century, showing that the family remained prominent even after many others had disappeared from the political stage. In the 2nd and 3rd centuries, several powerful aristocratic families maintained influence within the Roman Senate, and among them stood the Valerii, a lineage that combined ancient prestige with political adaptability. One important member of this family was Valerius Claudius Acilius Priscillianus Maximus, the son of Apollinaris, who reached the ordinary consulship in the year 233 during the reign of Severus Alexander. His colleague in office, Cornelius Paternus, remains a shadowy figure whose background and career are only partly known. After completing his consulship, Valerius Maximus was appointed supervisor of the Tiber River and later took part in the Senatorial uprising of 238, a moment of crisis when members of the aristocracy resisted imperial authority. During that turbulent year, he served among the Vigintivirii and acted as a close associate of the emperor Pupienus. His influence did not end with the failure of the revolt. Decades later, under the Emperor Valerian, he reached the prestigious position of prefect of the city of Rome and even held a 2nd consulship, confirming his status among the highest ranks of Roman society. The long and complex name of Valerius Maximus suggests connections with the ancient Acilii, one of the old aristocratic families of Rome. The evidence points toward marriage alliances that linked the Valerii and the Acilii across generations, strengthening the political position of both houses. This connection becomes even more likely when considering that Valerius Maximus later shared a consulship with Acilius Glabrio, a prominent member of that same family. Such alliances were typical of the Roman aristocracy, where family strategies ensured that influence could be preserved through marriage as well as through public office. These ties also reinforce the idea that political authority belonged to a limited circle of established families rooted in Italy. Valerius Maximus was probably the father of Valerius Poplicola Balbinus Maximus, a descendant whose name deliberately recalled the famous Republican statesman Valerius Poplicola. This younger Valerius began his career with strong imperial support, holding the offices of quaestor and praetor as official imperial nominees. He later served as a financial supervisor and judicial representative in Italy, before reaching the ordinary consulship in 253, together with Volusianus, the son of the emperor Trebonianus Gallus. The early stages of his career suggest that the family had already attained patrician rank, placing them among the most prestigious aristocratic houses. After his consulship, he remained active in Italy, holding several administrative positions, although he never achieved the distinction of a proconsulship or a second consulship like his father. Another member of the family appeared in the consular records in the year 280, a man named Messala, who is now believed to have belonged to the Valerii, and was probably the son of Poplicola Balbinus Maximus. His colleague in that year was Gratus, likely a member of the Vettii. Beyond the fact of his consulship, little is known about Messala's career. Even so, the continued appearance of the Valerii in the lists of consuls shows that the family remained influential across several generations. In the 4th century, the Valerii still held high office, though less frequently than before. Some descendants became governors of provinces or prefects of Rome, while others held senior administrative commands. Over time, the prominence of the family gradually declined, yet their long survival demonstrates the resilience of the Roman aristocracy, even during periods of political upheaval. Another important senatorial lineage of the period was the Vettii. Their origins are uncertain, though they may have come from Italy, Gaul, or North Africa. The first member of the family to reach consular rank was Gaius Vettius Sabinianus Julius Hospes in the later 2nd century. Unlike many old aristocratic houses, the Vettii rose from equestrian status. Hospes had originally been a knight and entered the Senate through imperial favour. His marriage into the distinguished Scipio family helped strengthen his social position, but his military achievements were probably the decisive factor in his promotion. He fought successfully against Germanic tribes and supported the emperor during a dangerous rebellion, achievements that eventually earned him the consulship. Afterward, he governed several frontier provinces and eventually served as proconsul of Africa, one of the most prestigious offices open to a senator. By the early 3rd century, the Vettii had become firmly established among the aristocracy and may even have achieved patrician rank. The first consul of the new century from this family was Vettius Gratus Sabinianus in 221. He was probably the son or grandson of the earlier consul Hospes. His advancement through the offices of quaestor and praetor as an imperial nominee suggests that he belonged to the highest level of Roman society. Unfortunately, little is known about his later career, and it is possible that he died not long after his consulship. The next generation continued the family tradition. Vettius Atticus Gratus Sabinianus became consul in 242, while another relative named Vettius Gratus reached the consulship in 250 alongside the Emperor Decius. A further member of the family, named Gratus, served as consul in 280, probably representing the 3rd generation of consular Vettii. Over time, the name continued to appear in official records well into later centuries, suggesting that descendants of the family remained active in imperial administration. Whether these later figures were direct descendants or merely claimed the prestigious name is impossible to determine with certainty. The Virii formed yet another senatorial family whose influence rose during the late 2nd and 3rd centuries. Their geographical origins remain uncertain, though the family name appears frequently in northern Italy and may point to that region as their homeland. The first known consul of the family was Virius Lupus, a military commander who supported Septimius Severus during his struggle for power. Before reaching the consulship, he governed Lower Germany and fought in the civil wars that brought Severus to the throne. After Severus secured victory, Lupus was sent to govern Britain, a difficult and dangerous province where Roman authority had weakened. His appointment shows the level of trust placed in him by the emperor. Lupus was probably the father of two later consuls, Lucius Virius Agricola and Lucius Virius Lupus, who reached the consulship in 230 and 232. Their careers are only partly known, but they seem to have continued the rise of the family into the highest ranks of Roman society. By this time, the Virii may have achieved patrician status, though the evidence remains uncertain. A later descendant named Virius Lupus reached high office in the later 3rd century. After holding a consulship, he served as an imperial judicial deputy in the eastern provinces and eventually became prefect of Rome. He also held a second consulship together with the Emperor Probus, an honour that reflected exceptional prestige. Another member of the family, Virius Orfitus, became consul in 270 and later served as prefect of Rome as well. Through these careers, the Virii reached the peak of their influence in the 3rd century, though later generations remained active in imperial administration. Long before the Severan age, emperors were already drawing trained legal minds into their inner circle. But under the Severans, something sharper happened. Jurists stopped being occasional advisors and started becoming central operators of government. In that world, expertise in law could lift a man into the most powerful rooms of the empire, sometimes all the way to the top of the equestrian hierarchy. The careers of Papinian, Ulpian, and Paul show how this worked in practice, and why it later faded. Papinian's rise looks like a blueprint for how talent could become authority. He moved through roles that sat close to the emperor's daily machinery, handling fiscal cases, shaping responses to petitions, advising a prefect, and then stepping into the prefecture itself. By the early 3rd century, he was no longer simply a famous legal writer. He was positioned where decisions were made and enforced. His path shows how legal skill, combined with access and trust, could turn a jurist into a political heavyweight. Ulpian's story follows a similar arc but with a different texture. He appears first as a capable professional inside Rome's legal environment, then as someone attached to senior administrators. Later, traditions try to map his early career in neat steps, but even if some details are blurred, the pattern is clear. He learned inside the orbit of power, then began producing official legal writing in a style that matches what imperial offices were issuing at the time. Eventually, he held major posts tied to supply and public order, and under Severus Alexander, he reached the Praetorian prefecture itself. That promotion matters because it reveals the Severan habit of treating high legal intellect as a qualification for the state's most sensitive command, even when soldiers and court factions disliked what a strict administrator represented. Paul is harder to pin down by office titles. Unlike Papinian and Ulpian, his formal appointments are elusive, and later writers may have exaggerated his peak rank. Yet his own legal work repeatedly places him inside discussions that happened at the emperor's side. The value of that evidence is not that it proves a particular job title, but that it shows participation. Paul writes, like someone who heard debates, weighed arguments, and watched decisions being framed into policy. In other words, even without a clearly documented public career, he belongs to the same phenomenon: jurists operating from inside the ruling circle. Beyond the famous three, other high-level jurists also appear in this period. Modestinus, for instance, is presented as a learned legal specialist whose reputation was strong enough to put him in positions of responsibility, including roles connected with policing and the night watch. Later, narratives add the detail that he taught an emperor's son, which may reflect legend or reality, but it still captures the social idea of the time. A top jurist could be seen as suitable to shape an imperial heir. More solidly, imperial documents from the late 200s and 30s treat him as a figure of real authority, someone whose opinion had already been delivered on a disputed question, and whose standing was respected in official language. Then he vanishes from view, which is itself a clue to the changing climate after this generation. One of the most revealing careers is that of Licinius Rufinus, reconstructed mostly from inscriptions. He seems to have moved through a chain of offices that linked culture, administration, and imperial justice. He was connected with Greek correspondence, with study and preparation, and with the emperor's legal activity. Then come hints that he held petition-related posts and financial roles, and at some stage he was brought into the Senate. He did not merely become a senator in the abstract. He advanced through praetorship, governed a province, and reached consular standing. What makes Rufinus especially striking is that one inscription takes care to mark his equestrian rank before naming his later consular dignity. That explicit sequence suggests a social memory of upward motion. He started as an equestrian insider, then crossed the boundary into senatorial prestige. By the mid-3rd century, however, this recognizable group of court jurists begins to thin out. After roughly the 200s and 30s, identifiable legal writers at the emperor's side become rare, and the old model of the scholar official producing major works, while shaping policy, seems to fade. Some scholars argue that jurists continued to staff key petition offices and maintain technical quality there. But the style of imperial replies changes, and fewer jurists appear as towering public intellectuals. At the same time, fewer of them seem to reach the very highest equestrian commands. One explanation is structural. Emperors increasingly delegated judicial business to deputies, and those arrangements may have lowered the visibility and the status of Rome-centered legal elites. Another explanation is social. Networks of recommendation and patronage shifted, and the traditional pipeline that carried scholarly jurists into central power no longer worked as strongly. A parallel track helps explain the wider environment. Earlier in the empire, the most visible imperial secretaries often had literary and cultural backgrounds because their work was built around words, documents, and communication. Yet some men reached those posts after long careers in the army and provincial administration, proving that secretarial power did not always come from being a polished intellectual. One example is Varius Clemens, who climbed through a heavy chain of military commands and provincial financial posts before ending up as the emperor's chief letter writer. What makes that role important is not the title itself, but the influence it could carry. If the secretary controlled information and recommendations, he could help push careers forward. In periods of crisis, that kind of gatekeeping becomes decisive, because commanders and governors must be selected fast, and the emperor leans on whoever can supply trusted names. Another career illustrates the same logic even more dramatically. Marcius Claudius Agrippa is described as rising from slavery into fiscal advocacy, then being exiled, then recalled and lifted into powerful secretarial work under Caracalla. He was then brought into the Senate and given important provincial commands. It is hard to explain every twist, but the overall point is clear. Proximity to the emperor through secretarial service could become a launch pad, even for someone with a damaged past. It was a position where trust, utility, and political need could override conventional expectations. After about 240, the trail for imperial secretaries becomes thinner. Either fewer records survive, or the offices became harder to track inside a more bureaucratic system, or secretaries stopped travelling with emperors as often. Earlier evidence shows that secretaries could accompany emperors during campaigns and manage communication while the ruler was away from Rome. But by the middle of the 3rd century, the emperor's priorities had shifted. Military emergencies were no longer occasional interruptions, they became the constant background. When an emperor lives on campaign, he naturally meets more commanders, logisticians, and fiscal specialists than rhetoricians and jurists. Legal business still existed, but it was no longer the obvious centre of imperial time and attention. There are even cases where emperors explicitly refused to hear disputes, because the demands of war made it impossible to focus on civilian judgment. The overall picture that emerges is a transformation in who mattered at court. In the earlier phase of the 3rd century, sophists and jurists were among the winners. Their education, status in provincial cities, and command of language made them attractive to emperors, who still spent significant time managing petitions, hearing cases, and ruling through documents. But as the empire's crisis deepened, other kinds of expertise began to dominate the emperor's entourage: military planning, supply chains, taxation, requisition, and rapid administration in the field. At the same time, emperors visited Rome less often, and the centre of gravity shifted toward wherever armies were operating. In that environment, the men who had influence were those who were physically present with the emperor in the field, those who could move troops, gather resources, and keep the system functioning under pressure. That shift also changed the equestrian order itself. Earlier, many prominent equestrians who reached high office were not defined primarily by a soldier's resume. They were notables with wealth and education, often rooted in provincial elites, whose cultural standing helped pull them into imperial service. In the 3rd century, another type rose faster and in greater numbers: military professionals who began as ordinary soldiers and climbed into equestrian rank through battlefield experience and command. Older financial barriers that once limited entry into the equestrian order appear to have softened or lost force. Over time, these military upstarts became the dominant circle, especially obvious when considering the background of the men who reached the imperial throne in the late 3rd century. At first, some of the new equestrian power looked temporary, because equestrians were often placed as acting deputies in roles traditionally held by senators. That acting language could hide the scale of the change. It might have softened resistance by making the shift seem provisional, and it could even blur the awareness of the equestrians themselves that they were building a new centre of power. But across decades, real influence tends to pull status upward. Titles that once belonged only to a narrow set of equestrian leaders started spreading. More officers were honoured with higher-ranking epithets, rather than the older, lower grades. By the later 3rd century, even provincial equestrian governors and field commanders could receive designations that earlier would have been exceptional. Eventually, under Constantine, the process reached its endpoint. High equestrian posts were folded into senatorial dignity as a general rule. To see how power and status interacted in detail, the Praetorian prefecture is the best lens. It was always an equestrian office, so it does not show a simple swap from senators to equestrians. But it does show how one equestrian position could steadily expand from a primarily military function into something that resembled a ministerial command, spanning security, justice, and at times, civil administration. At its core, the Praetorian prefect's first duty remained personal protection of the emperor and the imperial household. In moments of chaos, prefects tried to keep rulers alive, calm mutinies, or manage panicked troops. Because of that bodyguard role, prefects often travelled with emperors. In the early 3rd century, there are repeated traces of prefects present on campaigns, listed as close companions and sometimes dying alongside the ruler they served. But the same closeness that made them indispensable also made them dangerous. The prefect was the one man permitted to carry weapons in the emperor's presence. When trust broke, the consequences were fatal. Some prefects helped overthrow emperors, engineered assassinations, or tried to seize power themselves. Others were killed the moment they were suspected of ambition. The relationship between emperor and prefect was therefore built on loyalty, and emperors often chose friends, relatives, or men tied to the imperial household to reduce the risk. Sometimes the bond went even further, with prefects married into the imperial family, turning political trust into family obligation. To limit the concentration of power, it was common to appoint 2 prefects at once. This shared arrangement appears often in the early 3rd century. In some cases, the pairing may even have divided duties, one prefect leaning toward military command and the other toward administration or law. Yet, as the century progressed, evidence for consistent pairs becomes thinner. That may partly reflect gaps in survival of sources, but it may also reflect a practical need. When prefects were increasingly dispatched to handle separate crises, a single prefect with broad authority could be more useful than 2 men forced to share a role at the emperor's side. The military side of the office also expanded. Prefects had always commanded the Praetorian Guard, and at times they led additional troops when emperors could not personally take command. In the 3rd century, this became more frequent. Prefects were sent as crisis managers, commanding field armies, directing major expeditions, and acting as the emperor's substitute in war zones. Under Gordian III, for example, the prefect Time Scythius led major operations in the east, and, by reputation, became the effective power behind a young emperor. Later, prefects continued to operate in that pattern, sometimes fighting far from the ruler or holding command even after promotion. By the late 3rd century, the prefect could be the obvious figure to lead rapid intervention in Italy itself, because no other commander could match his prestige and immediate access to imperial authority. Whether the prefect held a permanent legal command over all Italian troops is harder to prove. Some units clearly interacted with the prefect's office, and some campaigns show fleets or strategic legions fighting under prefectural direction. But the evidence suggests that these arrangements were often situational rather than fixed. The safer conclusion is that the prefect was the highest-ranking military officer in Italy and could be used as a supreme commander when needed, even if not every unit was formally subordinate at all times. Alongside military authority, the prefect's legal power grew sharply, especially under the Severans. Prefects had long exercised police powers in Rome and handled prisoners and security cases. Over time, they became regular participants in the emperor's advisory council, helping shape decisions and justice at the top. By the early 3rd century, prefects held independent judicial authority in Italy and presided over a major court in Rome, often functioning as the emperor's representative. In practice, their judgments could be treated as final. Their court also became a place for appeals, including appeals from decisions made by provincial governors, at least in certain circumstances. An imperial ruling from the mid-3rd century even suggests that general directives issued by a prefect could be treated as binding unless they contradicted existing law or had been overturned by the emperor. The technical meaning of the wording is debated, but the direction is clear. The prefect's office was becoming a source of enforceable rules, not merely an executor of orders. It is no coincidence that the Severan era placed jurists into the prefecture. Papinian held it. A legally trained bureaucrat like Macrinus moved from advocacy into the imperial fiscal machine and then into the prefecture, before taking the throne himself. Ulpian reached the office as the most famous legal mind of his generation and was treated by some accounts as the emperor's chief advisor. These appointments make sense in a government that still invested heavily in petitions, rescripts, and judicial administration. They also expose a tension. A jurist prefect might strengthen legal coherence and administrative control. But he could collide with military culture, especially in Rome, where soldiers disliked tight discipline and resented civilian authority. Ulpian's violent end shows that brilliance could be politically fragile. Civil administrative power is the hardest part to measure. There are hints that prefects sometimes acted as coordinators within the broader imperial staff, and that other officials consulted them on administrative disputes. But it is not clear that this created a stable chain of command where financial secretaries and provincial officials were truly subordinate to the prefect as a matter of routine. It may have been more practical than constitutional. In moments of confusion, the prefect's rank and proximity to the emperor made him the person to call, even without formal hierarchy. Later, reforms tied the prefect more clearly to large-scale fiscal responsibilities, especially the supply system that fed armies, but the exact timing of that transition remains disputed. What can be said with confidence is that as military crisis intensified, the prefect increasingly operated as the emperor's deputy in whatever sphere required urgent action. Taken together, these developments changed the nature of power. The prefect's authority no longer depended on being physically beside the emperor every day. He could be sent out to command, punish, negotiate, and decide, carrying the emperor's force with him. That autonomy made the prefect resemble a prime minister in practice, even if the language of delegation remained flexible and often informal. Status, however, lagged behind power for a long time. From the earliest empire, the praetorian prefect had enormous influence, but belonged to an order socially inferior to senators. A deep political instinct kept that separation in place. Giving a prefect both equestrian command and full senatorial prestige risked creating a rival too strong to control. The classic warning example was Sejanus under Tiberius, who combined extraordinary influence with the honours of high office and ultimately paid for it with his life. After that, the system generally insisted that if a prefect was to enter the Senate, he should leave the prefecture first. Honorary insignia could be granted, but full integration into senatorial rank, while still holding the guard, was treated as dangerous. In the 2nd century, emperors began giving some prefects consular-style honours and allowing them to use senatorial titles. But this still stopped short of full senatorial membership. Then, under Septimius Severus, the boundary was crossed in a spectacular way with Polliani. He was raised high, treated almost like a member of the ruling family, given the consulship, and allowed to remain prefect while functioning as a political force comparable to a co-ruler. Public honours even placed him alongside the imperial family, in ways that were extraordinary. This was a direct challenge to senatorial sensibilities, and to the old logic of keeping the prefect powerful but socially restrained. The backlash and the eventual killing of Plautianus restored the older caution, and later, Severan emperors were far more careful about letting a serving prefect accumulate both power and senatorial status. For a time after the turmoil of the late 200s and 30s, senatorial honours for sitting prefects seemed to recede. That restraint did not necessarily signal weakness. Men like Timesitheus and Priscus could rule effectively without needing senatorial titles, especially when they operated in the east or alongside armies, where senatorial prestige mattered less. It may even reflect a subtle devaluation of senatorial status in a world where survival and command mattered more than inherited rank. By the 260s, the balance shifted again. As senators concentrated more on Italy and a smaller set of traditional provinces, and as equestrians held more of the crucial military commands, it became easier to grant senatorial standing to the most powerful prefects without fear of restoring the old senatorial dominance. In this new setting, emperors began appointing serving prefects directly as ordinary consuls, making the consulship itself their route into senatorial status. Unlike the earlier Severan habit of treating honorary insignia as if it were a real previous consulship, the later practice was cleaner. The prefect became consul and therefore senator, and the sequence was publicly intelligible. Even then, the order of names and ceremonial precedence could be managed to avoid insulting old aristocratic expectations. From that point, the upper levels of equestrian and senatorial careers began to merge. Some ex-prefects moved into the urban prefecture and other top senatorial positions, including the most prestigious, provincial governorships. Under Diocletian, the trend continued without a sudden break. Under Constantine, it was finalized, with high equestrian prefectures effectively absorbed into senatorial dignity. What does all of this mean for the story of jurists and intellectuals? Their Severan rise was real, and it was tied to a specific kind of imperial government, one that still lived inside documents, petitions, legal debate, and Roman-centered administration. When the empire's center moved toward permanent campaigning, emergency logistics, and constant military management, the skill set that mattered most changed. Legal specialists did not vanish overnight, but they became less visible at the very top. The emperor's side filled increasingly with men who could move troops, secure supplies, and manage fiscal extraction under crisis conditions. In that new world, the jurist who once dominated the imperial council became a rarer figure, while the soldier administrator became the model. The situation was not limited to Italy. By the middle of the 3rd century, the judicial authority of provincial governors could be challenged by the praetorian prefect, who had the right to review and overturn decisions. This meant that even governors from the highest aristocratic families could see their authority questioned by an official who did not necessarily belong to the senatorial order. For many senators, this must have been difficult to accept, since traditional Roman society placed great importance on rank and social prestige. However, the prefect usually acted as the emperor's representative, and this connection to imperial authority made the arrangement easier to tolerate. The prefect's decisions were understood as extensions of imperial power rather than personal interference. By around the year 260, the transformation of the imperial administration was already well advanced. Many positions once reserved for senators were increasingly filled by equestrians. Even so, emperors still moved carefully. Gallienus occasionally granted senatorial rank to important officials such as Volusianus, allowing them to take part in senatorial life while continuing to hold powerful administrative offices. This kind of promotion may have made it easier for high officials to exercise authority without constant reference to imperial delegation. With the emperor often occupied by military campaigns, it became practical for trusted officials in Italy to handle legal and administrative matters on their own initiative. Although this development is difficult to prove in detail, it is likely that rank promotions helped align social standing with real authority and prevented tensions within the elite. The gradual elevation of praetorian prefects shows that the social structure of the empire was becoming more flexible, but emperors still avoided reforms that might offend the aristocracy. Only in the early 4th century did prefects and other senior equestrian officials regularly receive senatorial rank. Even then, emperors remained cautious about removing traditional offices from aristocratic families. The prestige of the Senate continued to matter, even in an empire that was changing rapidly. The growing importance of praetorian prefects was closely connected to the changing background of the emperors themselves. During most of the 3rd century, emperors increasingly came from military careers rather than the traditional senatorial elite. Before the late 260s, only a few emperors clearly began their rule as equestrians. But afterward, this became far more common. This shift shows that senatorial status was no longer essential for becoming emperor. Even so, new rulers usually accepted senatorial rank soon after their accession and often served as consuls in order to demonstrate their place within Rome's traditional hierarchy. The symbolic importance of the Senate remained strong, even as real power shifted elsewhere. At the same time, the duties of praetorian prefects evolved. Early in the century, they were often known for legal knowledge and administrative skill. Many of them had careers in law or finance before reaching high office. Contemporary writers often described legal expertise as the ideal qualification for a prefect. Later in the century, however, prefects appeared more often in military roles. This reflected the changing needs of the empire. Constant warfare along the frontiers required experienced commanders, and emperors increasingly relied on officials who could manage armies as well as administration. From the middle of the 3rd century onward, emperors were forced to concentrate almost entirely on military emergencies. Campaigns on distant frontiers demanded constant attention, leaving little time for legal or administrative affairs. As a result, praetorian prefects took over responsibilities that had once belonged to the emperor himself. It is difficult to determine whether these responsibilities were formally attached to the office or assigned individually, since the imperial system never defined such roles precisely. The prefect's authority could therefore appear either as personal power or as delegated imperial authority. The surviving evidence does not clearly settle the question. What is clear is that the development of the prefecture reflected the changing character of imperial rule. In the later 3rd century, prefects often operated far from the emperor and dealt independently with military crises. Long stays in Rome became impossible for emperors, who were constantly required in different regions of the empire. Some focused on eastern campaigns, while others fought in the west, leaving trusted deputies to manage the remaining territories. In many cases, these deputies were praetorian prefects. Sometimes emperors appointed relatives as prefects, since family ties offered a guarantee of loyalty. In other cases, prefects were connected to the imperial household through marriage or other alliances. Such relationships strengthened trust and also raised the social standing of the prefect, making his authority more acceptable to the aristocracy. A prefect who belonged to the imperial circle could represent the emperor more convincingly than an outsider. Throughout the 3rd century, the power and prestige of praetorian prefects rose alongside the transformation of imperial rule. Earlier figures had gained influence mainly because weak emperors allowed them to dominate government. In contrast, the prefects of the 3rd century expanded their authority because emperors were overwhelmed by external threats and constant warfare. Prefects assumed increasing responsibility in administration, law, and military command. Eventually, the Praetorian prefect became the second most powerful figure in the empire, surpassed only by the emperor himself, and sometimes rivaling even imperial authority in practice. The equestrian order, from which most prefects were drawn, was never a uniform social group. Some equestrians rose to prominence through education and intellectual reputation. Under the Severan emperors, scholars and legal experts often served as imperial secretaries and advisors. Their learning gave them influence at court and brought them high prestige. They handled financial administration, legal decisions, and bureaucratic management, playing a role similar in some respects to that of the senatorial elite. Their importance depended largely on the emperor's presence at court and his interest in administrative affairs. When emperors spent more time on campaign after the 200s and 30s, these intellectual officials gradually became less visible in government. At the same time, another group of equestrians rose to prominence. Increasing numbers were appointed as provincial governors and army commanders, replacing senators who had traditionally held these posts. At first, these appointments were often described as temporary substitutions, but over time they became normal practice. Many of these officials were experienced soldiers who had earned equestrian status through military service. Although they formed only a minority within the equestrian order in earlier centuries, by the 3rd century professional officers dominated the highest ranks. The roots of this development lay in the wars of the late 2nd century, when capable military officers gained rapid promotion. By the 200s, the empire urgently needed such men. Their authority rested on practical experience, control of troops, and access to supplies and resources. Their power was concentrated in military commands, and their authority extended mainly over the soldiers they led. The scale of their influence depended on the size of their forces and the importance of the regions under their control. The office of Praetorian Prefect developed along similar lines. Early in the century, prefects were closely associated with legal and administrative work, but after about 240, military authority became increasingly central to their role. This shift reflects the broader transformation of the equestrian elite, in which professional soldiers gradually replaced scholars and legal experts as the dominant figures of imperial administration. A comparable change occurred among the emperors themselves. Rulers, who spent most of their time in Rome, chose advisors skilled in administration and law, while emperors who spent years on campaign preferred experienced commanders as their closest assistants. Ideally, a prefect combined military ability with administrative and legal expertise. Sometimes emperors appointed 2 prefects at the same time in order to balance different skills and limit the power of each individual. Over the course of the 3rd century, however, this practice became less common, allowing single prefects to accumulate greater authority. Eventually, the social status of prefects rose to match their power. Some received senatorial rank and even served as consuls while continuing to hold the prefecture. From the 260s onward, this became more frequent. Such promotions brought prefects closer to the traditional aristocracy and allowed them to operate more independently. Whether their authority remained formally delegated by the emperor or became attached permanently to the office is uncertain, but their influence clearly expanded. The rising status of leading equestrians suggests that senatorial rank gradually lost some of its exclusive prestige. Equestrian emperors and powerful officials who never entered the Senate demonstrate that influence no longer depended entirely on traditional status. Even so, senatorial rank remained the highest social distinction available, and continued to carry great symbolic value in many parts of the empire. During the early 3rd century, several powerful military commanders rose through the ranks of the Roman Empire, often gaining influence through their connections with the imperial court. One such figure was Iulius Septimius Castinus. an experienced officer who governed Pannonia Inferior until the year 212 and was later appointed governor of Dacia around 215. His career reflected the importance of loyal military commanders during the reign of the Severan emperors. Castinus maintained close ties with the imperial household and enjoyed the confidence of Emperor Caracalla, which allowed him to receive increasingly responsible commands. His fortunes changed after the rise of Emperor Macrinus. Castinus was removed from power and forced into exile in Bithynia, where he lived quietly for several years. Eventually, during the reign of Elagabalus, he was put to death. Contemporary observers believed that Castinus was considered dangerous because of his strong character and his popularity among the soldiers. His long military service and personal association with Caracalla had made him well known throughout the army, and this reputation may have made later emperors suspicious of his ambitions. Another important officer of the period was Oclatinius Adventus, who served as praetorian prefect under Caracalla. Adventus was an experienced soldier who accompanied the emperor during the campaign against the Parthians in Mesopotamia. During this expedition, he likely commanded the Praetorian Guard in the field. His military service brought him high honours, and by 216 he had received the insignia of consular rank, a distinction that marked him as one of the most respected officers in the empire. Under Emperor Macrinus, Adventus rose even further. He was admitted into the Senatorial order and soon afterward appointed prefect of the city of Rome. In 218 he served as consul alongside the emperor himself. Although he was later replaced as city prefect, he continued to hold the consulship even after the fall of Macrinus. Soon afterward, Adventus disappeared from the historical record, and it is likely that he died, not long after these events, probably due to advanced age. The careers of these men reveal an important feature of imperial government during the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Senators still held great authority in military affairs and commanded large armies in the provinces. Governors of provinces that contained several legions possessed enormous resources and could challenge imperial authority if they chose to do so. This danger became clear during the political crisis that followed the death of Pertinax in 193. At that time, the imperial throne was contested by several provincial commanders. Didius Julianus briefly seized power in Rome by bribing the Praetorian Guard, but the real struggle came from the frontier provinces. Pescennius Niger controlled Syria, Clodius Albinus held Britain, and Septimius Severus commanded the Danubian armies in Pannonia. Severus ultimately triumphed because he controlled the strongest military forces. His victory demonstrated that the loyalty of the legions was more important than political influence in Rome. Having gained power through military command, Septimius Severus clearly understood the danger posed by powerful provincial governors. During his reign, several large provinces were divided into smaller units, so that no single governor would control too many troops. These reforms reduced the risk that another ambitious commander might follow his example and claim the imperial throne. Senators also served as commanders of temporary field forces assembled for particular campaigns. These generals were often appointed to lead detachments drawn from different legions and sent to deal with specific military emergencies. Successful commanders might be used again in later campaigns. Although Severus occasionally entrusted provincial governors with such tasks, he usually preferred to appoint officers from outside the affected region in order to avoid concentrating too much power in a single province. Some of these commanders came from long-established aristocratic families and had already reached the highest ranks of the Senate. Their support helped strengthen Severus's political position during the early years of his reign. Others were newcomers who had risen through talent and experience rather than birth. Even officers of relatively modest rank could receive major commands if they demonstrated ability and loyalty. Alongside these senatorial commanders served equestrian officers who acted as their subordinates. These men often commanded smaller detachments or specialized units. In rare cases, an equestrian officer might receive an independent command, but most remained under the authority of senatorial generals. This structure allowed the emperor to benefit from experienced soldiers, while maintaining control over the army's leadership. During the early years of his reign, Severus relied heavily on the support of the senatorial elite. Some senators with limited military experience served as advisors within the emperor's entourage during campaigns. Their wealth, influence, and connections in Rome helped secure political support for the new regime. Others had real experience in warfare and logistics and contributed directly to military operations. Over time, Severus became more cautious. Senators whose wealth and social influence might make them dangerous rivals were gradually moved into administrative positions where they commanded fewer troops. This policy prevented powerful aristocrats from building independent military bases. Some former generals received promotions and governorships, while others disappeared quietly from public life. After the civil wars and eastern campaigns had ended, Severus no longer needed so many senior commanders. By the time of his expedition to Britain, many of the generals who had served him earlier were no longer active in the field. This policy ensured that no individual officer accumulated both great prestige and a large military following. By the 260s, the role of senators in military affairs had become extremely limited. A few rebel leaders may have belonged to the senatorial class, but the evidence for their social rank is uncertain. Even if some of them were senators, their revolts only accelerated a process that had already begun decades earlier. Senators had gradually disappeared from the highest military commands, and the few possible examples are too uncertain to demonstrate continued senatorial dominance. One clear exception was Odaenathus in the east, who received senatorial rank because he exercised both military and civil authority over a vast region. His position required influence not only over Roman officers, but also over local rulers and allied kings, for whom senatorial status still carried weight. In general, however, the real military influence during Gallienus's reign belonged to equestrian officers. These men had risen through the army, built strong connections with other officers, and controlled troops and supplies in strategic regions. Many of them came from the Danubian provinces, where constant warfare produced experienced commanders. The military structure itself had also changed. Defense along the frontiers relied increasingly on permanent field armies, assembled from detachments of several legions. These forces were commanded by generals known as duces, who operated independently in regions exposed to repeated invasions. Although the exact organization of these commands is often unclear, these officers clearly controlled mixed forces drawn from different legions. Their responsibilities often overlapped with those of provincial governors. In heavily threatened regions such as Illyricum and Gaul, these generals sometimes replaced governors in military matters entirely. Because frontier warfare had become a permanent condition, this system gradually turned into a stable feature of imperial defense. This arrangement depended on the loyalty of individual commanders, and that loyalty could not always be trusted. Several generals attempted to seize imperial power, relying on the support of the troops under their command. Their authority, however, was usually regional rather than universal. A general might be accepted as emperor in one province but ignored elsewhere. As a result, most revolts remained limited in scope even when they threatened imperial authority. To deal with these dangers and respond quickly to emergencies, Gallienus created highly mobile field forces under experienced commanders. Some of these generals are described as commanders of cavalry. but their forces probably included infantry as well. Cavalry units formed the fast-moving core of these armies, allowing them to move rapidly from one crisis zone to another. These mobile armies appeared successively in widely separated regions, suppressing revolts and defending the frontiers. This flexible system anticipated the more organized, mobile field armies that would emerge in later centuries. The growing importance of professional officers is also visible in the development of the protectors, a special group of trusted military men attached to the emperor. Commanders of army detachments were often drawn from this circle. The title strengthened the personal bond between the emperor and his officers, and marked them as members of the imperial military household. Many of these officers served close to the emperor and formed the core of his military staff. The title acted both as an honour and as a reminder that loyalty to the emperor was expected above all else. Gallienus also relied on regional leaders who acted on their own initiative. Some were Roman citizens who organised local defences when imperial forces were unavailable. Others were allied rulers or tribal leaders who were allowed to settle within imperial territory in exchange for defending the frontier. This policy was not entirely new, but during the 3rd century it became far more common. In some regions, these allies formed an essential part of the defensive system and helped compensate for the shortage of regular troops. The balance of power during Gallienus's reign clearly favoured equestrian officers rather than senators. Senators lacked the military experience and the professional networks needed to operate effectively in a period of constant warfare. Connections within the senatorial aristocracy were no longer decisive. Instead, influence depended on relationships within the officer corps and on the ability to command troops in difficult conditions. While equestrian power increased, individual commanders were prevented from becoming too powerful because military authority was divided among many officers. Each general controlled only part of the available forces, usually in distant frontier regions. Even the commanders of mobile field armies rarely succeeded in challenging imperial authority for long. Only when several of these forces gathered in one place did imperial power become seriously threatened. This happened at Milan, where officers from different regions assembled with their troops and eventually turned against Gallienus. The emperor, who had risen to power through the support of frontier armies, ultimately died at the hands of officers drawn from those same regions. The reigns of Septimius, Severus, and Gallienus illustrate how conditions had changed during the 3rd century. Severus faced major wars only during limited periods and enjoyed long intervals of relative stability. Gallienus ruled during a time when military crises followed one another without interruption. Even the calmer years of his reign never brought the kind of lasting peace that Severus had experienced earlier. Because Severus dealt with conflicts one at a time and in clearly defined regions, he did not need to rely constantly on his officers. Gallienus, on the other hand, confronted multiple threats at once across widely separated frontiers, and depended heavily on his commanders throughout his reign. Another important difference was that Severus often chose when to wage war, launching campaigns when conditions seemed favourable. Gallienus rarely had such freedom. Most of his campaigns were defensive responses to invasions and revolts. He reacted to events rather than directing them. Soldiers and civilians alike understood that the emperor could no longer control every situation, and loyalty to imperial authority weakened accordingly. The social composition of the officer corps also changed dramatically. Under Severus, the highest commands were usually held by senators, who governed imperial provinces and commanded the legions stationed there. These governors controlled large forces and possessed significant resources, making them potential rivals to the emperor. Special commanders appointed for particular campaigns were also often senators, supported by equestrian officers who served as subordinate commanders. Senators without extensive military experience sometimes accompanied the emperor as advisors, contributing wealth, influence, and political connections. By the 260s, this system had largely disappeared. Permanent military emergencies required more specialized leadership, and equestrian officers with long military careers became the dominant figures in the army. These men commanded frontier armies and mobile detachments and replaced senators in the most important military roles. Senators were no longer needed as advisors on campaign, since their political influence could not compensate for their lack of military experience. Professional officers took their place, combining practical knowledge with connections inside the army and familiarity with the frontier regions. As military expertise became more important, senatorial rank lost its value as a goal for ambitious officers. Successful equestrian commanders were no longer routinely elevated into the senatorial order. By the time Gallienus ruled alone, the separation between civil and military careers had become clear. Senators rarely served as officers, and equestrian commanders rarely became senators. In regions dominated by warfare, military authority and senatorial status increasingly moved apart. Both Severus and Gallienus attempted to prevent their officers from becoming threats to imperial power. Severus strengthened loyalty by rewarding the soldiers generously, increasing their pay, and granting new privileges. He reorganized the Praetorian Guard and expanded the forces stationed in Italy and along the frontiers. Members of the imperial family appeared frequently with the army in order to reinforce the bond between dynasty and soldiers. His policies made clear that the stability of the empire depended above all on the loyalty of the army. At the same time, Severus remained cautious toward his senior commanders. He avoided allowing powerful senators to accumulate too many troops and often transferred them into administrative roles after they had served in the field. Generals, who had risen through talent rather than birth, were used more frequently. But even they rarely retained major commands for long. By the time Severus campaigned in Britain, late in his reign, most of the earlier commanders had been replaced. Gallienus faced a different situation. The greatest threats no longer came from wealthy senators, but from experienced officers who commanded loyal troops. These equestrian generals possessed the same advantages that provincial governors had once held: soldiers, supplies, and strong personal connections. Unlike Severus, Gallienus never enjoyed a period of peace in which dangerous commanders could be dismissed. His officers understood their importance and sometimes used their power to pursue their own ambitions. To maintain control, Gallienus adopted several strategies. Military authority was divided among many commanders, each responsible for a limited region or task. The emperor took a more active role in campaigns and supervised operations personally, whenever possible. The new system of mobile field armies allowed forces to be moved rapidly to threatened areas. Professional officers were organized into the group known as the protectores, strengthening their loyalty to the emperor and forming a dependable command staff. Gallienus also relied on regional allies, including local leaders and foreign rulers, who defended frontier territories in return for recognition and settlement rights. Earlier emperors had made similar arrangements, but during the 3rd century, such agreements became far more widespread. Some of these allied forces even served as mobile units, supporting Roman armies. Despite constant warfare, Gallienus managed to hold power for many years, and several of his innovations proved effective. Later, emperors adopted similar methods, building on the structures developed during his reign. The comparison between the periods of Severus and Gallienus reveals two long-term developments that shaped the later empire. Equestrian officers became the dominant military leaders. and military authority became increasingly separated from senatorial rank. What had begun as gradual change hardened into a permanent system in which civil and military careers followed different paths. Later, reforms would formalize this division and make it a defining feature